Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good night, wherever you are and whatever time it is. I'm so glad you are here joining us for this conversation about making room in the pews for working class UUs. My name is Rose Littler Rydell, and I am joining you today from the unceded land of the Kumeyaay, known today as San Diego, California. I am the Working Class Caucus Coordinator for UU Class Conversations, and will be joined today by one of our Working Class Caucus facilitators, the Reverend Charlie Arp. I thought we could start today with a brief look at the history of class that exists in our denomination and how classism is still present in our denomination today. The notion of being high class is ostensibly a point of pride throughout the denomination and throughout time. But why? This may be due to the stronghold of Unitarians in Boston in the mid-19th century. The Unitarian foothold in the spaces of education, economics, and politics in Boston can be seen held in esteem in many congregations today, proudly boasting of the history of Unitarian academic and socioeconomic dominance. Though our Universalist history may be that of a more working class population than Unitarians, our historical roots in Universalism are not free of classism either. For example, Universalist George Pullman was a railroad magnate who cut jobs and increased working hours, precipitating the violent Pullman strike of 1894. By the end of the 19th century, Unitarians and Universalists began to converge upon each other, and their differences were found more deeply in theology than in socioeconomics. The mid-20th century fellowship movement targeted communities for growth that were white, primarily wealthy neighborhoods, while cities with large concentrations of immigrants and African Americans were specifically avoided. Here we can see the intersectionality between the denomination's struggles with racism and classism. These are two issues that are separate and important within the denomination, and they intersect with each other in very profound ways. In our Unitarian Universalist communities, we often talk about racial justice, gender equality, LGBTQ plus rights, and other important social issues. These conversations are crucial, and we must also recognize that classism is intertwined with these struggles. The experiences of marginalized people are shaped by the intersections of their identities, and class plays a significant role in that. Denise Moorhead says in her article titled "Breaking the Silence About Class in One Liberal Denomination," too many UUs from less class-advantaged backgrounds feel embarrassed by their lack of a degree, never mention what they do for a living, or feel deeply humiliated during church canvas time or the annual pledge drive, depending on your congregation's verbiage. So let me share with you a few quotes that I have curated from members of our denomination from all over the country, from all aspects of our denomination, from youth to clergy, who have been affected by classism in UU spaces. A youth in our denomination says, "Youth events are so incredibly expensive. I've literally only been able to go to 2 youth events in my life, and with scholarships. My friends have not been so lucky with scholarships. It feels like the more labels you have, the more likely you are to get a scholarship. So my poorer white friends have not been able to go to any youth events. It's unfortunate." A UU minister says, "The water communions became travel logs, excluding those who could not afford to travel. There were service auctions where nothing was auctioned in a range affordable to less wealthy congregants and minister. Another minister in the denomination says, there's this bias that we have around curriculum and assumptions made in curriculum around what family looks like, that everyone has professional careers and children move away across the country, and so many things that presume a certain kind of lifestyle that doesn't include other kinds of families. A lot of assumptions on how families look do not apply to the impoverished or working class. A religious educator in our denomination said, as a religious educational professional, the message was loud and clear to me and my Laredo colleagues. If you want to be taken seriously and valued for your work, get a degree. Better yet, a postgraduate degree. This is a clear message, especially given how long religious education professionals fought for the right to be voting delegates, a status which no longer applies once you retire, unlike our ministerial colleagues. A congregant was quoted as saying, "For me, it's the weekly generosity offering. To be asked weekly to give money that I don't have, and then to have to sit while the majority of the congregation is making visible donations makes me feel uncomfortable. The visible offering, or lack of, in a way feels like it's easy to point out that I'm not giving." Another minister in our denomination says, "Why do I think classism continued on in UU spaces? I think it's continued for all the reasons that supremacy cultures perpetuate themselves. It's comfortable, and people with privilege want to keep their privileges." Oh, this handful of quotes is an illustration of why it is important to have these conversations. Really listen to each other, and perhaps most importantly, take action to affect change. Before I continue with suggestions for how individuals, congregations, and organizations can engage in this work, I'd like to invite my dear colleague, the Reverend Charlie Arp, to speak to you about his personal history with class in our denomination. Charlie?
Hi, everybody. My name is Reverend Charlie Arp, and I live in Evanston, Illinois, on the north border of the city of Chicago. I have lived in this area since 1986. I was ordained by the People's Church of Chicago and the Unitarian Church of Quincy, Illinois in 2021, which was the second year of the pandemic. I was serving them virtually in Quincy, but I was a member of the People's Church of Chicago, which is why they agreed to ordain me. So my story is how I found my place in Unitarian Universalism. And it was the People's Church is where I found my place. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a Pentecostal preacher's kid. My grandfather was born into poverty, lived in poverty. My grandmother, grandfather on my mom's side, they grew up in poverty. My lot of poverty, particularly in the generation before my parents. Now, my parents did go to college. They did get an education, but they came from poor. And so they never quite fit into the middle class. And my dad was a pastor in a Pentecostal denomination. And in the 70s, he ended up getting a job in the city of Chicago as a pastor. And he couldn't make a living. And so my mom had to go to work for the first time. So this was my first experience of double income, right? Double income, two kids. My parents were bringing in two incomes. My father's was very low because his church was going broke. And my mom was making, she had a college degree, but she didn't really have a professional outlet. She eventually became a school teacher, but that's after, kind of more after I was out of the picture. Um, But at any rate, my parents were not wealthy. They weren't middle class. In fact, that my extended family was poor. So I grew up with this sense that there are poor people and there are rich people in the United States, and that's just two Americas, as it were. So as an adult, in my 18, 19, I went to Bible college when I was 19 for the first time, and I realized I didn't want to become the kind of Republican Christian that was being pushed in the 80s at Pentecostal Bible colleges. So I dropped out. I also met my wife to be and fell in love and said, well, getting married is far more important than getting a degree, in my opinion. And so I dropped out. For one thing, my father couldn't really afford to send me to school. I'd won a scholarship, but because I kind of hated the school, I didn't try. And so I didn't keep the scholarship because I left. So that was my first attempt at a college degree. And I've dropped out 4 times total. I may not tell you all 4 times, but what happened the next 3 times? I was married, we had a kid, and my second attempt at college, my second child was born. So we had 2 kids, and I wasn't going to go into debt to get a bachelor's degree. So I dropped out of college again because of my second child. The third time I dropped out was because my wife was basically funding my education by being employed by a college. And as long as she worked for that college, my tuition was negligible. It was a few $100 a year or semester or whatever, really low. We could totally afford it. So for 2 years, I went to school as one of my wife's benefits. Well, she got let go because they downsized the college. They did a budget adjustment and she lost her job. And so I had to leave college. So that was so there's my story. Multiple times I ran out of money and couldn't finish college. So I am working class. So in 2002, I get my first, what feels like a permanent job. I work for a travel company, a vacation company, and I'm a call center customer service rep kind of thing. I'm helping people with travel vacations, primarily travel agents. I was not working really with the direct public. My company was wholesale, although they did eventually start selling to the public. But at the time when I started, it was only with travel agents. So I worked with travel agents and I became really good at the job. I knew the vacation market in and out. Now, I said I was a Pentecostal. By this time, I'd become a Quaker. And I was going to Quaker meeting and I really liked it because there was no preaching, there was no hymn singing. It was just sit in silence for an hour and meditate on whatever is going on with you. But I did notice that there was still a class difference. Most of the people in my Quaker meeting were well educated, had jobs that were well paying. I'm still making less than the minimum, sorry, less than a living wage. I made more than minimum, but not a living wage. So my wife had to work with 2 kids. My wife had to work. So for most of our marriage, both of us have had to work. And that's been the story in the second half or the third quarter of the 20th century. From 1975 onward, women have entered the workforce in greater and greater numbers every year. And my wife was a part of that trend. She probably would have wanted to be a full-time mom, but wasn't feasible. We had to, figure it out. So because I'm a preacher's kid, in the back of my mind somewhere is one of these days I want to become a minister, but I'm so unorthodox. My faith shifted. By the time I became a Quaker, I didn't, wasn't even, probably didn't, I didn't believe in God, or at least I didn't think there was a God. I wasn't an atheist, but I said I'm a non-theist. I don't take into, I, I'm an agnostic. Ultimately, I don't know whether there's a God, but I'm not trying to figure that out either. I'm satisfied that whatever infinite being there may be is really doesn't have a lot to do with me. Now that's changed over time, but that's where I was as a Quaker. God isn't important to me, but sitting in silence in this warm space that Quakers created was great for me. Trayvon Martin's murder and the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement woke me up. I said, okay, I've been going to this all white Quaker meeting. Maybe 1 or 2 Black people would show up. And I said, and race is obviously a bigger problem. And economic inequality was a bigger problem. Occupy Wall Street, all of these things were happening. The country felt like it was moving. We were moving into a new era of like the 60s where Everything was on the table. We were going to change our world all over again. And so I said, okay, I need to find a church that is directly involved in anti-racism and anti-poverty work. Well, another weird thing happened that kind of aimed me at the Unitarian Universalists, and that was when Carlton Pearson came out as a Universalist and subsequently blew up his integrated megachurch. He was a You've probably heard some parts of the Carlton Pearson story as Unitarian Universalist. Well, here's how his story affected me as this Pentecostal, fourth generation Pentecostal, just like him, although I'm about a decade and a half younger than Carlton Pearson. Um, Hearing that he found his place at All Souls in Tulsa, well, maybe there's a place for me. So I started looking for a Unitarian Universalist church that would accept me, that would feel like a faith community I could belong to. Well, the biggest one in my area is the Unitarian Church of Evanston, and I lived in Evanston a couple of times. Maybe I'll go there. No, I didn't like it. It something about the culture did not fit my working class sensibilities. I went to Second Unitarian down in Chicago. It was a little better, but there was still something it didn't click for me. But then I discovered the People's Church of Chicago. People's Church of Chicago at one time was the biggest Unitarian church in the world. But they run into hard times. And in the 1980s, when their pastor retired, his name was Preston Bradley. And again, he created the biggest Unitarian church ever. Um, he needed to retire. And eventually he died a few years later. Um, but the church never recovered from that because when they lost their superstar founding pastor, they really didn't know how to survive. And the Unitarian Universalist Association really didn't do anything to help the People's Church because they were not focused on urban ministry. They were focused on the suburban and the college towns and where most of our churches are today, college towns and suburbs. So People's Church was kind of left high and dry. And they said, well, how are we going to make something of ourselves? And what happened is that the United Church of Christ, a pastor in the United Church of Christ, said, hey, I really like this little Unitarian People's Church of Chicago. Would you be willing to join the UCC and we'll help you out because we have some money for urban ministry? And that's how they survived, was with the United Church of Christ helping them out. Now, they never left the Unitarian Universalist Association. They've always been a member of both. I shouldn't say always. Since some point in the 80s, they became a member of the UCC, but they retained their Unitarian Universalist membership. And when I discovered the People's Church, their pastor was a Unitarian Universalist, not a United Church of Christ pastor, but she was preaching from the Bible because remember, this was a church that nearly died and was saved by the United Church of Christ. And they found that by having a Christian service, they attracted more people than they did if they'd gone with the more Unitarian Universalist approach. Now, the first Sunday I'm at People's Church, I'm saying, wow, a Unitarian Universalist church that preaches from the Bible? I don't get it. But something is happening in me. Something is holding me here. And I could talk about, I was on a mission. As I mentioned, the Black Lives Matter movement, the rise of Occupy Wall Street and the critique of American economic inequality just lit something in my soul. And I said, this is the moment I've been waiting for to begin to make a change and to become a minister. Now, Quakers have a whole other theology of ministry, which is why I had to find, not only was it an all-white congregation, but it was also didn't have a path for ministry that I could make sense of. There are I know Quaker ministers, but they go a very different direction than I was interested in. So the People's Church of Chicago, as I said, was a Christian Unitarian Universalist congregation because it was duly affiliated with the United Church of Christ. And eventually I just realized that, well, that's more like where the working class is. Working class is a little more Christian. Now, that's not a blanket rule. I know atheist people in the working class. There are many of them. But there's also in the United States, and particularly African American working class people, tend to be very Christian. And that's one of the barriers to them feeling welcome in a Unitarian Universalist church. And I have some thoughts about that. This is the first little bit of advice. If you are at a Unitarian Universalist church and you're wondering what would be attractive to working class people, try having a second service that is Christian. Scary idea, but believe me, I think it would work. I haven't tried it out, but I think it would work. All right, back to my story. So, how I found my place was I ended up at the People's Church and I noticed something about them during the joys and sorrows part of the service, which I'd never seen before. I didn't know it was a thing in UU churches. People would get up who were black and brown and poor because there was a men's homeless shelter based in the building of the People's Church of Chicago. And there was a daily free lunch, except for Tuesdays, I think. They did free lunch every day except Tuesday. So this church was serving the poor. This was a neighborhood in Chicago called Uptown. Now, Uptown was Al Capone's old neighborhood, right? So in the gangster days, it was where a lot of the mob was operating. But when all that happened in white flight in the 70s and 80s, it became more black and more brown, and a lot of immigrant populations chose Uptown because the rents were lower. Sorry about that little thing. And so People's Church was directly serving the poor. So that's how I found my place in Unitarian Universalism, was through the People's Church of Chicago. Now, I'm not going to say it's been easy. I went to a Unitarian Universalist seminary in Meadville, Lombard for 3 years. I loved it. And yet it was still very clear to me that I'm a different class. I've never made a living wage in my entire adult life. When I left my travel industry job to pursue ministry full time, I was making barely $15 an hour. And that was in 2017. $15. My wife was a little better off. She has a college degree, so she was able to usually make more money than me, but we both had to work to make ends meet with two children, raising two children in the city of Chicago. So I found my place in Unitarian Universalism in an unconventional UU congregation, and I had to struggle with it because I had left Christianity behind in some sense. I Jesus was okay, but I couldn't I couldn't, I wasn't thinking in Christian terms when I ended up at the People's Church. But their commitment to working with poor and working class people won me over despite the theological challenge. And I would now say I'm way more comfortable with Christianity than I was when I started. And I have the People's Church to thank for that. Um, so again, I don't know what else would help Unitarian Universalists, working class Unitarian Universalists feel more welcome. One thing I would suggest is maybe start a little caucus group. Find out, are there actually working class Unitarian Universalists in your congregation? Would they be willing to be a part of a caucus group? Don't don't try to get them to tell you about their class struggle. I mean, that's, just like you don't want black people. Tell me how racism has affected you. Hey, those are personal struggles. Why do we want to make, why do we don't want to, we shouldn't, you know, try to appease our white consciences by hearing the sad stories. Working class people need their own way to connect. And it may not be to talk about how difficult it is to be working class, which it really is, but there may be a reason why people of a working class orientation or working class experience and an economic situation might want to talk to other people in a similar situation about life and might have more in common with them. So that's another idea is, have a little caucus group, which is what we've been trying to do this past year. So that's my story. I found my place in a very unconventional church, but I am convinced that Unitarian Universalism can become working class welcoming, but we need to do it because we love or we care about the working class people. We don't want to be a project. You've probably heard some of this. It's not enough to be an ally. What you need to be is an accomplice. You need to join working class people in their struggles. this would be another great way is educate yourselves about economic inequality in the United States and how hard it is. But at any rate, the working class Unitarian Universalists are out there. There are people who grew up in whatever kind of church they did, or maybe even more, many more grown up without any religion, but there's something attractive to them about a congregation. And educating your congregation about economic injustice and class inequality would go a long way towards making working class people feel at home and welcome in a Unitarian Universalist congregation. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say. My name is Charlie Arp. You can email me at revcharliearp. That's Charley. Last name is spelled EARP. REVCHARLEYERP @gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook. Google Reverend Charlie Arp. I'm on Facebook. And I'm happy to preach at your congregation about class and how the working class can find welcome, how church can become welcoming and inclusive of working class people. So I bid you peace, and I bid you love, and I bid you, above all, a thirst for justice.
Thanks so much, Charlie, for both your vulnerability in discussing your personal history and for the work that you've been doing. So let's get to action we can take. Starting with caucusing. Why caucusing? The class struggle in Unitarian Universalism stretches back through time and needs to be addressed through conversation. As is often the case with dominant and oppressive systems, those that benefit from those systems are often unable to see the systems. This is not nefarious or done with malintent. Those in higher socioeconomic class stations don't recognize the classist behavior keeping others out or away because they're not affected by them. Therefore, continued conversations are so important. UUs of varying class backgrounds need to listen to each other with an openness and a true sense of empathy if Unitarian Universalism is ever going to break down its class walls and become a space that is truly for all. Caucusing opens up space that is safe for folks with shared identities to talk about what they struggle with within our denomination, where there are commonalities and differences, and what actions would make UU spaces more comfortable and accessible. Boards and ministers should make themselves available to these caucuses, listen to, and take action on those issues that are affecting their congregations and communities. Now, I'd like to invite you all to please join us at caucuses during General Assembly. I would so love to speak with you, so I hope I will see you there. But what else can be done, individually or congregationally? Education. You knew I was going to say it, right? Books that can be read individually or engaged with in a book group include Elite, Uncovering Classism in UU History, Class Action, The Struggle with Class in Unitarian Universalism, and both of those are available at uuabookstore.org. And also, I'd like to recommend Meditations on Class, Reflections, Insights, and Commentaries, which is available at uuclassconversations.org. I would also recommend congregations engage in study groups to really dig into the work of widening the circle of concern. And engage with UU Class Conversations. Go to uuclassconversations.org and check out the resources. Reach out and see how you can be involved in the work. UUs should also advocate for policies and practices that address classism in UU spaces. Consider things like, does your congregation Or do your committees require leaders to spend their own money and then be reimbursed for things? This prohibits people without funds from rising to leadership. Or how about, are all of your meetings and events geared towards people with 9 to 5 jobs? How does someone on a 3 to 11 shift get to participate in the life of your church? How can these issues and issues like these be addressed in your congregation? Friends, UUs are a loving people that strive for justice. I firmly believe that the classism that exists in UU spaces is not a matter of intention, but rather a matter of attention. May we all pay attention. Thank you.